Imagine standing barefoot on a beach 65,000 years ago. The horizon is nothing but endless, empty ocean in every direction. No distant mountains, no birds returning from land, just blue. You have no maps, no compass, and zero metal tools of any kind. Not even a written language to record the crazy idea forming. Yet somewhere past that terrifying void sits a whole continent. An entire landmass no human eyes have ever seen before. Here's the thing. Someone looked at that emptiness and said go. Not next season. Not after inventing better boats, right now. With technology so primitive it would get laughed out of a museum. Bamboo rafts held by vines, fire-hardened wood, pure gamble. Honestly, respect. We panic if the Wi-Fi drops for 10 minutes. These people stared down open ocean and decided to gamble everything. Let that sink in for a second. This was a deliberate choice. No one was chasing them into the water. Land was still available. They simply chose the most dangerous option on the menu. And before you ask, yes, they had no idea what waited on the other side. No guarantee of food, no guarantee of land, no way back home. Just 100 miles of deep, current-driven ocean to cross. This was not a Netflix adventure with a happy ending scripted. This was real people risking total erasure for a maybe. Boom. One storm and the entire group vanishes without a trace. Yet they did it. They reached a continent no human had touched. How does a Stone Age mind look at that horizon and paddle out? That's the question that still bends modern brains in half. We assume safe arrival is the default setting of travel. They paddled into pure unknown with no promise of tomorrow. You are the living proof that at least some of them made it. Their reckless curiosity rewrote the trajectory of our species. This impossible voyage is the first great ocean gamble in history. And it all started with one group staring at empty water. But to understand how they even got the chance, we need to go deeper. Go back 65,000 years. Earth is locked in a deep ice age freeze. Massive glaciers have swallowed huge volumes of ocean water. Sea levels have dropped by more than 100 meters worldwide. Southeast Asia and Australia are suddenly much closer neighbors. The gap shrinks from an impossible chasm to something almost doable. But here's the catch that ruins every simple migration theory. Even at the absolute lowest sea levels, a deep channel remains. A stretch of real, open, current-driven ocean still sits between them. This was never a dry land stroll across a temporary land bridge. Somebody had to look at that water and decide to float across it. No gradual walking path ever existed. The ocean was always there. Let that sink in. Ice Age did the heavy lifting, but not enough. It reduced the distance to roughly 100 miles of open sea. Still far enough that you cannot see the other side from the shore. Still deep enough that swimming is pure suicide for an entire group. Still full of currents that do not care about your survival plans. Honestly, respect to the glaciers. They tried, they just fell short. The Vanishing Land Bridge is more of a vanishing almost bridge. It created the opportunity, but humans still had to seize it by force. They had to invent floating platforms from whatever the forest offered. Bamboo, logs, vines, and pure refusal to accept the ocean as a wall. This is the moment the Ice Age handed them a narrower death trap. And they answered by building the first ocean-going vessels we know of. No metal, no nails, no sails, just Stone Age engineering and guts. The Deepwater Channel became the final boss of human expansion. Everything before this point was continental walking and short hops. This crossing demanded a completely new relationship with the sea. You cannot accidentally drift 100 miles of open ocean by luck. Someone had to plan, build, and deliberately push off into the blue. The Ice Age opened the door a crack. Humans kicked it the rest of the way, and that decision left physical proof waiting for us on the other side. Bones and tools that should not exist if the ocean had stayed a barrier. The proof does not whisper. It sits in the dirt of northern Australia. Human bones and stone tools appear abruptly around 65,000 years ago. No slow trail of earlier campsites leading in from the coast. They just show up fully formed on a continent that should be empty. This is the archaeological equivalent of finding a phone in a pyramid. Something that should not be there according to every migration map. Genetic studies of indigenous Australians back the same hard date. Their ancestors split from other human groups at roughly that time, and the surrounding islands hold the final piece of the puzzle. Sites on the Indonesian side stop short of any continuous land path. There is no chain of stepping stone islands that stays dry. Every possible route still demands a real ocean crossing. Deep water, strong currents, no accidental rafting possible. Let that sink in. The dirt itself refuses the easy explanation. If humans had walked, we would find gradual evidence along the way. Instead, we get a sudden appearance on the wrong continent entirely. Honestly, respect to the archaeologists who first dated these sites. They had to argue against every textbook assumption of the time. Bones that old in Australia forced a complete rewrite of the timeline. Stone tools with no local predecessors, just pure arrival signature. This population did not evolve in place. They arrived by water. The ocean crossing is no longer a theory. It is a measured fact. Radiocarbon and luminescence dates lock the event into deep time. No later wave of migrants can explain the earliest layers. The first people were already there when the Ice Age was still raging, and they brought the full toolkit of modern human behavior with them. Fire, complex tools, and the ability to plan multi-day sea voyages. All of it appears fully operational on day one in Australia. The primary evidence leaves zero room for a dry land alternative. Someone crossed open ocean with Stone Age gear and made it stick. The bones on the wrong continent are the receipt for that gamble, and they force us to confront just how fragile those first rafts were. Researchers got tired of guessing and decided to rebuild the rafts. They used only materials available 65,000 years ago. Nothing modern. Bamboo poles lashed with vines, fire-hardened wooden paddles, zero metal. No nails, no rope from factories, no waterproof sealants of any kind. The goal was simple. Could a Stone Age crew actually cross that gap? Experimental voyages launched from islands near the ancient departure zone. The rafts floated. That was the easy part. Everything else was chaos. Ocean swells slammed the bamboo frames and tried to tear them apart. Currents shoved the vessel sideways faster than any paddle could correct. Progress was painfully slow. Days of effort for a few miles of drift. Crews sat exposed under the sun with no shelter and almost no shade. Water soaked everything. Food spoiled. Energy drained with every hour. Honestly, respect to the volunteers who signed up for that nightmare. Modern safety boats hovered nearby. The originals had no such luxury. One serious storm would have turned the entire experiment into wreckage. The rafts proved just how fragile the original vessels must have been. They were not sleek canoes. They were floating compromises with physics. Every wave was a negotiation. Every night was a gamble against the dark. Let that sink in. These were the best possible Stone Age ocean craft. And they still felt like death traps the moment the shore disappeared. Researchers documented leaks, structural flexing, and constant repairs. Bamboo absorbs water and grows heavier the longer it stays afloat. Vines stretch and loosen under constant tension from the waves. The whole platform becomes a living, shifting, unreliable surface. Yet somehow, against every reasonable expectation, the concept works. A determined crew can keep a bamboo raft pointed in roughly the right direction. It is not elegant. It is not safe. But it is technically possible. The experimental crossings turned theory into wet, exhausted reality. They showed the chaos factor was not a minor inconvenience. It was the main event. Surviving the crossing meant surviving days of pure exposure and uncertainty. No GPS, no weather forecasts, just bamboo, muscle, and stubborn refusal to sink. And that is the exact technology that carried the first humans to Australia. Australia was not the only ocean challenge in the region. Nearby island chains sat just as close, sometimes even closer. Yet many of them stayed completely empty of humans for millennia. This is the part that turns a success story into a genuine mystery. If Stone Age people could cross open water, why stop at Australia? Why leave entire archipelagos untouched for tens of thousands of years? The answer is that this was never a general talent for seafaring. It was one specific high-stakes gamble that somehow paid off. Think of these islands as one-way doors scattered across the sea. Some doors opened early and stayed open. Others stayed locked shut. Australia got its first humans around 65,000 years ago. Certain neighboring islands remained human-free until much later. The archaeological record shows a pattern of extreme selectivity. Not every stretch of water got crossed just because it was possible. Currents, winds, and pure luck decided which doors swung open. A successful crossing required the right departure point and timing. Miss either factor and your raft simply vanishes into the current. Let that sink in. This was not a wave of confident ocean explorers. It was a handful of groups who hit the statistical jackpot once. Honestly, respect to the ones who made it. Most attempts failed. The empty islands are the silent proof of all the voyages that died. They sit there as geological receipts for the ones who never arrived. Later humans would eventually reach those same islands with better boats. But the early window belonged only to the Australia gamble. One-way doors explain why the map of early settlement looks so uneven. Some coasts light up with tools and bones. Others stayed dark for ages. The difference was not skill. It was which current caught which raft. This rarity is what makes the Australian crossing so extraordinary. It was not the start of a seafaring culture spreading in every direction. It was a single, almost impossible success against overwhelming odds. The exceptions proved the rule. Ocean travel this early was pure chaos. And that chaos left most of the nearby doors closed for a very long time. Here's the part no one likes to calculate out loud. For every raft that reached Australia, many more never did. Ocean currents in that region are strong, shifting, and merciless. A slight error in departure timing and the raft gets dragged away, swept into open water with no land in any direction for weeks. No survivors, no wreckage that lasts, no story left behind. The successful landing is the statistical exception, not the rule. Most attempts ended as silent disappearances under the horizon. Let that sink in. The colonization of a continent rests on corpses. Invisible failures that left zero archaeological signature. We only dig up the bones of the ones who made it to shore. The ones who never arrived simply became part of the ocean floor. Honestly, respect to the ones who tried and still vanished. Their courage was identical to the survivors. Only the current differed. This is the uncomfortable math of early ocean travel. Success required a brutal filter that most groups never passed. Strong currents turned every voyage into a high-stakes lottery ticket. Win and your descendants inherit an entire continent. Lose and your entire lineage ends in salt water and silence. The archaeological record is biased toward the winners by design. It cannot show us the rafts that capsized 3 days out. It cannot show us the groups that drifted until thirst killed them. Yet those failures were almost certainly the majority outcome. Australia's first humans were the rarest of statistical outliers. They were the ones the currents randomly decided to spare. Every later generation stands on a foundation of undocumented deaths. The ones who never arrived paid the real price of the crossing. Their absence is the dark mirror of the success story we celebrate. This is not a tale of inevitable human triumph over the sea. It is a tale of extreme selection pressure written in missing people. The ocean kept most of the tickets. Australia only collected the winners. And that is the true, uncomfortable cost of the first great voyage. Picture the exact second the first raft scraped against Australian sand. A continent that had been sealed off for millions of years just opened. No human footprint had ever pressed into this soil before. Every animal staring back had evolved in total isolation from people. Giant marsupials, massive flightless birds, reptiles the size of cars. None of them had any concept of what a human hunter even was. Zero evolved fear. Zero defensive instincts tuned to our presence. This was first contact in the purest, most one-sided form possible. The planet's most efficient predator had just arrived unannounced, and the entire ecosystem had no idea the rules had just changed. Let that sink in. A world that had never needed to fear us suddenly did. Within generations, the megafauna began vanishing from the record. Not from climate alone, from a new pressure they could not adapt to. Honestly, respect to the animals. They never stood a realistic chance. Humans brought fire, coordinated hunting, and relentless curiosity. Traits no Australian species had ever been forced to counter before. The ecological balance tipped the moment those first feet hit the beach. This was not a gentle introduction. It was an irreversible rewrite. Forests that had never burned under human control started changing. Food webs that had been stable for ages began to unravel at the top. The survivors of the ocean crossing became accidental ecosystem engineers. They did not know they were starting one of history's biggest extinctions. They were simply hungry people in a land that looked like endless food. Animals approached out of curiosity instead of fleeing in terror. That curiosity became a fatal advantage for the new arrivals. First contact lasted only moments. The consequences lasted forever. A world with no footprints became a world that would never be empty again. The isolation that protected Australia for eons ended in a single landing. From that beach onward, the continent belonged to a new apex predator, and every later human on Earth still carries the echo of that moment. The first footprints were not just marks in the sand, they were a declaration. A declaration that no ocean and no isolation could keep us out forever. That first crossing did more than populate a continent. It rewrote the psychological limit of what humans believed possible. Once the ocean had been beaten with bamboo and vines, the barrier broke. Every later seafaring culture inherited that original proof of concept. Pacific Islanders would one day read stars and currents like maps. Vikings would push longships into the North Atlantic with iron and sail. Modern ships would cross entire oceans under engines and GPS. But the blueprint started with Stone Age people who refused to stop. They proved no stretch of water was permanently closed to us. The courage required was identical across every later voyage. The technology improved. The underlying gamble stayed the same. Leave the known shore. Trust the vessel. Hope the horizon delivers land. Let that sink in. Every explorer after them walked a path they opened. Honestly, respect to the original crew. They had the hardest version. No charts, no rescue, no second attempt if the first raft failed. Yet their success became the silent permission for every voyage that followed. The evolutionary arms race was not just biological, it was cultural. Humans began treating the ocean as a road instead of a wall. Each new generation pushed farther because the first one had already won. From simple rafts to double-hulled canoes to steel hulls, the logic held. If they could cross 100 miles of open water with nothing, so could we. That realization sat in the background of every later expansion. The first Australian landing was the original proof that distance dies. Oceans shrink when humans decide they are no longer absolute barriers. This is why the story still matters tens of thousands of years later. It is the template for every time we look at an empty horizon and go. The raw engineering was crude. The psychological shift was permanent. Once the sea had been crossed, it could never fully intimidate us again. Later navigators refined the methods. They never had to invent the idea. The idea was already proven by people who had almost nothing to work with. That is the lasting gift of the first great ocean gamble. It turned the impossible into a problem that future humans could solve. Here's the part that should rearrange something in your chest. You board a plane today and assume you will land on the other side. Ships cross oceans under the quiet promise that arrival is normal. Safety is the default setting of modern travel. We barely notice it. 65,000 years ago, that assumption did not exist. A group of ordinary people stood on a beach and stared at empty water. No promise of land, no way back, no idea what waited beyond the curve. Just a deadly horizon and the decision to paddle into it anyway. They were not superheroes. They were humans with the same doubts as you. Yet they chose the unknown over the comfort of the familiar shore. Let that sink in for a second. You are the direct result of that choice. Every person alive today descends from someone who refused to turn back. Their reckless curiosity is written into the architecture of your brain. Honestly, respect. Most species never develop the urge to leave the known. We did. And once we started, we never stopped pushing the edges outward. The ape who sailed into the unknown is still sailing in every one of us. That same restlessness built cities, crossed planets, and mapped the stars. It began with a bamboo raft and a refusal to accept the ocean as final. You carry their world-conquering curiosity in your own blood right now. The next time you look at an empty horizon and feel that quiet pull, remember the first ones who felt it with far higher stakes and no maps. They did not know they were changing the trajectory of an entire species. They only knew the water was deep and the other side was possible. That was enough. It has always been enough for our kind. The philosophical twist is simple and almost unbearable in its weight. You are not separate from that ancient gamble. You are its living proof. Every safe arrival you take for granted rests on their unsafe ones. The ones who paddled out with nothing but hope and a fragile raft. They turned an impossible ocean into the first page of human expansion. And the story has never stopped. It is still being written by people like you. The ape who sailed into the unknown never really came back to shore. It is still out there, in us, looking for the next empty horizon to cross.